What's up, folks? I'm Chris, your NFL writer here at Occupy Fantasy, here with a look at the Week 11 main slate on FanDuel and DraftKings. Going to be going over some of the top plays, strategies, and lineup advice for this weekend's action in the NFL. Normally like to lead off the show with my favorite play. This time, I am giving you a tight end. I love Trey McBride this week. Despite playing with 3 different quarterbacks over the last 3 weeks for the Arizona Cardinals, now gets to play with the best one in Kyler Murray for the rest of the season, and he's been targeted on over 33% of his routes from those quarterbacks, is averaging 2.95 yards per route run in that stretch. By far, not just an elite tight end, but an elite pass catcher in the NFL right now. McBride's price still has not been adjusted for his true role and upside in Arizona's offense. It also happens to be true that the Cardinals get a very good matchup with Houston's defense, which is below average defending tight ends in football this season. So load up on Trey McBride as the first player in your lineups this weekend. That's what I'm going to be doing. Now, I like to typically walk through the biggest favorites on the board in betting markets to talk about which running backs we should be playing in the main slate. And the interesting thing about this week is that the biggest favorites on the board don't necessarily correlate with where we're projecting ownership to be at the position this week. We can go through the options and kind of dig into why that's going to be the case. Biggest favorites on the board this week, the Miami Dolphins are favored by 13.5 points against the Las Vegas Raiders this week. We have the 49ers favored by 12.5 points in their matchup with Tampa Bay at home. Dallas is favored by 10.5 in their matchup on the road at Carolina. And the Washington Commanders are favored by 9.5 points this week against Tommy DeVito's New York Giants. So it would stand to reason that we would be interested in Raheem Mostert, with the Dolphins being the biggest favorite, with the Dolphins carrying the highest implied team total on this slate. However, we are getting rookie Devin Achane back from injured reserve this week. That is the expectation that he will rejoin the lineup for the Dolphins. Add him to the mix with Mostert, Jeff Wilson, Salvon Ahmed, and we've got kind of a messy situation here. Not really sure how this is going to go. Don't think we want to have allocation to Miami running backs in low-risk contests anyway because of how messy this is going to be. I can tell you that in low risk, I think where everyone is going to be for Miami exposure is probably on Tyreek Hill, and I'm not going to disagree with that here. With the San Francisco 49ers, the problem with getting to Christian McCaffrey is I don't think we've really needed to pay up at the running back position all season long in any format thus far this season. Cannot argue with the workload. 20-point floor last week, finally not scoring a touchdown when he's been healthy and getting the touches. McCaffrey's an awesome play week in and week out. This is a difficult matchup. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers are the best defense in the NFL defending running backs in the passing game, which is one of the areas CMC thrives, right? But also a top 10 defense defending running backs on the ground. So I'm not going to deny that McCaffrey's usage in the 49ers offense is going to continue to be elite here in both the ground and through the air, but I don't think we have to pay for it, again, specifically in low-risk contests. McCaffrey's the most expensive running back on the board at $9,300 here on DraftKings and a whopping $10,000 over on FanDuel. Probably tournament play only for me as a result. Here, the Dallas Cowboys. Did you enjoy the Tony Pollard Express last week? 2 tackles inside the 1-yard line, touchdowns going to Jake Ferguson through the air, and Rico Dowdle got another rushing touchdown. Dak got a rushing touchdown. Here's the deal with Tony Pollard. Cowboys still have a top 10 run-blocking offensive line, and they're facing the second worst run defense in the NFL this season. He's still the RB1 for the Dallas Cowboys, even though Rico Dowdle plays enough to be a little bit of a concern, specifically in the red zone. Pollard is going to continue to be the best bet here until we see that workload dramatically shift in another direction. And in high-risk contests, Cowboys favored by over a touchdown. We're going to be interested in Pollard once again here, especially now that the field isn't necessarily on him after last week's dud. This is your proverbial flop leg spot for you poker players. Pollard definitely in a good spot here against the Carolina Panthers. Kind of concerning last week, he had no involvement in the passing game, no involvement in the touchdowns against the New York Giants, but maybe they were saving him for this week against the Carolina Panthers. And then we had the Washington Commanders in their game against the New York Giants, where we saw Brian Robinson get there through the air last week. Brian Robinson, the number 4 scoring running back in fantasy football land all season long, finally has one of the better matchups on the board this weekend. The low-risk running backs are going to be the running backs that we forecast to be the most popular plays on the board, and I'll go through them in a second because I do think we want to start the low-risk discussion with the quarterback position on this slate. Tua Tagovailoa's Miami Dolphins have the highest implied team total on this slate at just shy of 30 points, 29.75. I don't think we're going to be playing him in low-risk contests because of his $7,700 price tag here on DraftKings and $8,400 over on FanDuel. I think on this slate, you're going to see two quarterbacks capture the majority of the low-risk ownership. The first of which is Jared Goff. Goff's Lions are hosting the Bears in the second highest total game on the board, 48 points. Goff's been pretty efficient this season. Goff comes in $1,100 cheaper than Tua on this slate on DraftKings, $500 cheaper over on FanDuel, and we know exactly what we're getting in this spot from him here, and this does seem to be the player the field is concentrating on for low-risk contests this week. Goff also has an extremely clean matchup here. The Lions have the second best pass blocking offensive line, and they're facing a Bears defense that is the fourth worst defending the passing game. So all of these metrics kind of suggest Goff's going to be able to drop back with ease and find his favorite targets, most often Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? So Jared Goff probably going to be the most popular low-risk quarterback on this slate. I am partial to Kyler Murray at his low $6,100 price tag here on DraftKings and $7,600 over on FanDuel. He's $300 cheaper than Jared Goff, which, if we're doing the math here, makes him $800 cheaper than Tua Tagovailoa. Murray's Cardinals playing against Houston in that highest total game on the board, 49.5 points between the Cardinals and the Texans. Why no CJ Stroud after what we've seen him do? I'm not going to argue with anyone that wants to play CJ Stroud. I just think the $7,000 price tag, the $8,000 price tag on FanDuel makes him a little bit more of a tournament-style play, especially if the points scored between all these quarterbacks I've been discussing is relatively close. We want to pay down a little bit at the quarterback position. The Occupy model tends to agree with what I've described here, looking at projected ownership. Stroud is just slightly number one at 11%. Jared Goff, 10%. Kyler Murray down here at 9% on DraftKings. Others that are popping for low-risk contests, Purdy from the 49ers with their high total. Dak Prescott from the Cowboys with their high total. So this is where the low-risk quarterbacks are going to be. I think it's another situation like last week where we're going to look to the running back, the wide receiver position, see the best plays that we can get in our lineup, and we'll come back to the quarterback and use what fits with the remaining salary to make it work. We're not emphasizing the quarterback here as much as getting the best skill players possible in our low-risk lineups. I want to build a lineup that focuses on building around having Tyreek Hill as the piece from the Dolphins' highest implied team total offense. I think that it makes sense to want exposure to the Dolphins, so we're just going to plug him in here and see what this looks like for now. I'll come back to that after and discuss what to do if you're not going to play Tyreek Hill as well. At the running back position, we know this week's top plays are going to be Josh Jacobs from the Raiders, James Conner from the Cardinals, Breece Hall from the Jets, Travis Etienne from the Jaguars. Same deal over on FanDuel. We actually see Tony Pollard and James Cook from the Cowboys and Bills, respectively, flashing here with their upside as highest projected owned plays. This group does not really feature any of the running backs that are on the biggest favorites on the slate. Why are these guys going to be the most popular plays on the board this week? Flat out, most projection models are going to be super high on these guys, especially on their point per salary dollar projection basis, but just flat out underpriced role for a guy like Breece Hall, who has completely taken over the Jets backfield. Dalvin Cook has been reduced to a complete afterthought here. $6,400 for Hall against the Buffalo Bills here. And the Jets have actually been able to hold the Bills in check in their recent matchups together. Bills are kind of in flux right now. They've replaced their offensive coordinator. Could be a game where Hall is able to repeat the success that he had in week number 1, where he broke a couple of big runs against the Bills defense in the home opener for the Jets this season. So I think Breece Hall is going to be a great play this week. Looking at the matchup itself for Hall, the Bills are basically league average defending running backs in both the running and the passing game, and Breece Hall himself is an above average guy. So we can feel pretty comfortable slotting him into our low and high risk lineups, especially with the field on our side here. Another big underdog, Josh Jacobs Raiders, biggest underdog on the board. The Dolphins are one of the worst defenses defending running backs this season, 26th defending the rush by DVOA, 28th defending running backs in the passing game as well. But Jacobs, even at $6,800, even as a 13-point underdog, is seeing over 75% of team carries for the Raiders, and that's going to get people interested every single week, especially at somewhat of an underpriced salary if we somewhat ignore the betting market consensus on how this game is going to go. Jacobs interesting in low risk. Devin Singletary. Both Wednesday and Thursday this week, Dameon Pierce once again not practicing. DraftKings has kind of hedged and basically made Singletary and Pierce somewhat the same salary, but it does seem like Singletary is trending towards starting again here. Big game last week, probably in line for another big one here because the Cardinals are the 5th worst defense defending running backs on the ground, and they're not too good against them through the air either, bottom 10 in the league. Singletary at $5,300, get some correlation with Kyler Murray here. Really nice fit in a low-risk lineup. And now we're off to the races here with two guys that have really interesting salaries. Singletary is actually the #1 ranked running back in the Occupy model this week. He's an option for low-risk contests this week. And then finally, on the other side of this matchup, Arizona's James Conner, who returned and basically dominated all the opportunities in the backfield, only a few $100s more than Devin Singletary. These are the running backs that the field are probably going to be considering pretty heavily this week. We have our somewhat cheap tight end already on defense, which is the last place we can really save salary before we move on to talking about wide receivers. Looking at projected ownership, the Green Bay Packers against the Chargers is going to be 8% here on DraftKings at $2,300. I think this is your proverbial, they're close to the minimum price. We use them, we can jam all the plays we want around it type of play here. But it also doesn't hurt that the Chargers may be pretty banged up at wide receiver. Keep an eye on Keenan Allen's status this week. He's in danger of missing this game. Packers, we got $4,700 per player remaining. It doesn't seem like this is enough to get the wide receivers that we expect to be popular on this slate. Garrett Wilson, Tank Dell, Christian Kirk, all projected to be higher owned than Tyreek Hill on DraftKings. So there's two ways I think you can go about doing this. If you're going to play Tyreek Hill, you have to play a value, right? And I think to me it becomes a 2 running back week if you want to get Tyreek Hill in here. And I'm willing to sacrifice the 13.5 point underdog Josh Jacobs, play Breece Hall at a regular running back position, and then we can get a little creative with the tight end position. Already talked about how much I love Trey McBride. In our model this week, we have another tight end that is projected for a high amount of ownership, and it's Buffalo's Dalton Kincaid. Kincaid has seen a 25% target share over the last 3 weeks in this offense, the same number of targets as Stephon Diggs. He's basically the wide receiver 2 at this point. He's overtaken Gabriel Davis in terms of target share. I think you can justify playing 2 tight ends in low risk this week. If you want to jam Tyreek Hill in your lineup, this gives you $5,650 for those final 2 wide receiver spots. And in our model, that means you can get to 2 of these guys, Tank Dell, Calvin Ridley, Terry McLaurin, Marquise Brown. It's doable to build a low-risk lineup out of this group with Tyreek Hill here. Now, if you want to sacrifice Tyreek Hill and do the scary thing and have no exposure whatsoever to the Miami Dolphins game, then I would strongly encourage you to stick with the 3 running back model, using Hall at the flex, and just playing 3 of these highly projected owned wide receivers that also project for a ton of targets. Tank Dell, going to be the wide receiver 1 in the highest total game on the board. An underpriced Calvin Ridley, and we have $7,400 for our final spot. Maybe we upgrade the defense and play a defense that is actually in a good matchup that is favored. There's a lot of ways to make this work in low risk, but this is basically how I think you're going to see the slate go in low risk contests. 2 paths in low risk for those of you who want to play Tyreek versus not play Tyreek, but that's how I think it's going to go on DraftKings. Similar case here on FanDuel. I had it mapped out. Singletary, Hall, Hill, Tank Dell. You got $6,200 per player remaining. There's definitely a way to get this to work with the wide receivers that are available on this slate. $6,200 per player remaining if you're building this way over on FanDuel, and you've got cheaper plays like Calvin Ridley. Christian Watson is another player that we're super interested in, still on the underperforming wide receiver list. There's ways to make this fit here over on FanDuel, so that's a pretty good look if you ask me. High risk contests. Yeah, we're going to stay with Arizona and Houston. If we like them for low risk, then obviously they're going to be a framework for high risk as well. We can get Marquise Brown, Trey McBride, my favorite play on the slate. On the Houston side, we have access to a really cheap running back and an underpriced wide receiver 1. I think it's fair to argue Tank Dell has overtaken Nico Collins, who's going to be returning from injury this week. Tank Dell, really cheap, $5,750 per player remaining around this 3-2 here. This is probably how I would attack small field contests this week. Going back to the free NFL DFS strategy guide we have on OccupyFantasy.com, we talk about how a 3-2 stack is acceptable because it minimizes the number of things you need to get right to win the contest. One thing we do know is that the books are pretty sharp. Arizona and Houston has the highest total on the board in betting markets. I think this is an acceptable week to go with a 3-2 stack here with Arizona and Houston. Get a cheap defense in the Packers. We have running backs that the field is pretty high on that fit the rough salary criteria we have remaining. I got 7,150 here to finish off this lineup. Can I play Tyreek Hill and have a reasonable flex play with $5,000 left? Absolutely. You don't have to play Tyreek. You can play two really good players with the amount of salary that you have left here. I think this is my favorite way to play week number 11 slate. What's your favorite way to play it? I want to see some of the comments below. Talk about some of the top plays, top stacks that you have in high-risk contests here. Brian and Moose will be back this weekend to talk to you about the other stacks that we think are really doable. I'm getting ahead of myself because the one thing that I do want to discuss outside of this stack are these double-digit favorites on the board. Miami, Dallas, San Francisco. Our research has suggested that it's not worth it to use a bringback when you are stacking a double-digit favorite. So if you're playing the Dolphins, you can play Tua, you can play Tyreek, play another Dolphin. I wouldn't suggest bringing back a Raider. Only exception to that rule is maybe because of Jacobs' ownership. We can try to fiddle with something like that. But just in general, if the blowout takes place, the other team on the wrong side of that blowout doesn't typically have a player that does enough to crack the optimal roster in daily fantasy football anyway here on DraftKings and FanDuel. And you don't have to look too far into the past to see the most recent example of this. Dallas and New York last week. We did not see the Giants really have anybody that got there in fantasy, even though we had a bunch of Dallas Cowboys pass catchers getting there with Dak Prescott at the top of small field lineups, especially across DraftKings and FanDuel. So with Miami, I would play Tua, Tyreek, Waddle, the running backs if you're interested in them. Not interested in bringbacks from the Raiders outside of Jacobs for the ownership reasons we've discussed. With the Cowboys, not interested in any of the Carolina Panthers as bringbacks whatsoever. I think you can feel good about stacking Dak Prescott with CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, Michael Gallup, playing the running backs if you want. Don't have to use a Panther. And same story with the San Francisco 49ers in their matchup with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I don't think you need to worry about playing Purdy, Ayuk, Debo, McCaffrey, and using a bringback from the Bucs here because historical results suggest it's just not really the best way to play these types of games when they have these spreads in betting markets. That's my thoughts here on week number 11 in the NFL. I appreciate you guys as always for watching these videos. Give us a thumbs up if you like this video and you want to see more content like this throughout the rest of the NFL season and postseason. Lets us know that you're enjoying it. If you could subscribe to the channel, that'd be the best way for you to get notified when we have more stuff coming out. Gonna have a big week coming up next week with all of the short slates and showdown slates that are available for Thanksgiving, Black Friday, and as we move into the winter here, going to be some more weird NFL slates. So you want to make sure you're getting notified when we have new previews for you from the whole staff, not just NFL related, NBA as well. We're basically live every day on this channel talking about the NBA at this point, and we appreciate all of you engaging with that as well. As always, close every show with the same thing. Good luck in week number 11. We'll see you back here next week to talk about week number 12.